Thank you, Mr. President, and I'm proud to join Senator Brown on the floor to echo those comments. I agree that too big to fail, unfortunately, is alive and well, and that poses a real threat to all of us, to consumers, to citizens everywhere, fundamentally to the American economy. Coming out of the financial crisis, it seemed to me that the biggest threat and the biggest problem was continuing too big to fail. And I think now, several years after the passage of Dodd-Frank, we have objective numbers and evidence that that did not bury too big to fail. Again, there are objective numbers and evidence and pricing in the market that too big to fail is alive and well. Now, I think the fact that Senator Brown and I are both here on the floor, echoing each other's concerns, virtually repeating each other's arguments, is pretty significant. I don't know if we quite define the political spectrum of the United States Senate, but we've come pretty darn close. And yet we absolutely agree about this threat. And I think Senator Brown's historical analogy is right. It's like the unfettered growth and power of the trusts in the late 19th century. And there, too, folks of all sorts of ideologies correctly recognize that threat. Liberal Democrats, as well as Senator Brown's Republican predecessor, Senator Sherman, and, of course, the biggest Republican trustbuster of all, Teddy Roosevelt. It's the same issue. It's the intense concentration of power. And as a conservative, I'm very suspicious and nervous about that, whether it's when it's in government or whether it's when it's in the private sector. I think the sort of bipartisan consensus that perhaps we personify here on the floor is also growing outside Congress and outside this institution. Senator Brown alluded to some of it, but let me flesh that out. You have, for instance, Federal Reserve Board Governor Dan Tarullo. Now, he was appointed by President Obama. He was a prominent figure in drafting and implementing Dodd-Frank. But he has recently lamented, quote, to the extent that a growing systemic footprint increases perceptions of at least some residual too-big-to-fail quality in such a firm, meaning a megabank, notwithstanding the panoply of measures in Dodd-Frank and our regulations, there may be funding advantages for the firm, which reinforces the impulse to grow. Close quote. In a little more blunt terms, our colleague, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was also a figure in coming up with Dodd-Frank, said recently in our Banking Committee hearing with Chairman Bernanke, quote, I'd like to go to the question about too big to fail, that we haven't gotten rid of it yet. And so now we have a double problem, and that is that the big banks, big at the time that they were bailed out the first time, have gotten bigger. And at the same time that investors believe with too big to fail out there that it's safer to put your money into the big banks and not the little banks, in effect creating an insurance policy for the big banks, that the government is creating this insurance policy, not there for the small banks, close quote. In a similar way, you have those concerns echoed in the real world outside this body on the right as well. Recently, George Will said, quote, by breaking up the biggest banks, conservatives will not be putting asunder what the free market has drawn together. Government nurtured these behemoths by weaving in a provident safety net and by practicing crony capitalism, close quote. And Peggy Noonan, another well-known conservative, has said, quote, if you are conservative, you are skeptical of concentrated power. You know the bullying and bossism it can lead to. Too big to fail is too big to continue. The megabanks have too much power in Washington and too much weight within the financial system, close quote. So, Mr. President, I do think that there is a real and growing consensus in this body, in Washington, and in the real world, as I've suggested by those observers' quotes. And I think we need to build on that consensus and act in a responsible way. Senator Brown and I have been doing that, first with joint letters to Chairman Bernanke and others, focusing on the need for significantly greater capital requirements for the biggest banks. We think this would be the best and first way we should try to rein in too big to fail, to put more protection between mega banks' failure and the taxpayer, more incentive for the mega banks to perhaps diversify, perhaps break up, or at least correctly price their size and risk to the financial system. And we're following up on that initial work that was reflected in letters and specific suggestions to Chairman Bernanke with legislation that is quite far along that I know we'll be talking about more both today and in the near future.